Fans of HBO's Deadwood have reason to rejoice now as the long-awaited TV movie wrap-up finally made its way to screens after 13 years. I'm Zach Laws of Gold Derby, and with me now is Daniel Minahan. He's the director of this film. He also directed several episodes from the show's original run. And Daniel, I think that we've been waiting on this for so long. What do you think were the sort of serendipitous confluence of events that sort of made this the right time to make it?
I feel like over the years I've read a number of different versions of this script, and every year it never really came to fruition. And somehow David managed to tap into what I feel is like an emotional zeitgeist. It was an alignment of the planets to get all these actors back together, given the trajectory of their incredible careers. And I think it was just sheer will and determination on the part of our producers.
So then were you always the director that was going to do this? Or how did you end up being the guy, I guess?
I had a call from our producer, Carolyn Strauss, and asked me whether or not I would like to do it. It was maybe almost exactly a year ago from this time of year. I'm sure over the years, a lot of different people, just as I kind of got my hands on the scripts, I'm sure there were a number of different people who were pursuing it.
Mm-hmm. So then I guess, what was the thing that you wanted to capture in this return? I mean, having worked on episodes of the series, having been enmeshed in it for so long, what did you want to bring to it directorially?
We entered this with HBO with the clear intention of making it a movie. So we wanted it to be accessible to people who had obviously seen the series, but also be accessible to people who had never seen the series, and wanted it to stand alone without being too overly explained or pedantic. So, the cinematographer and I set out to really frame everything like a movie. We tried to block things and make it feel like it had that presence. One of our mandates always when we worked on the series was to subvert the tropes of the Western. That was really important to David Milch. And, we had a few very strong references that we always turned to, like McCabe and Mrs. Miller and Pale Rider. And we always thought of this as a story about a community and the origin of American society in this isolated little camp that at this point is entering legitimacy. South Dakota is becoming a state. So that kind of lawless little camp that we loved so much during the series, we meet them 10 years later, and they're kind of more organized. They're a town. There's a marching band. There's a fire brigade. There are vendors, and all the mines are more corporately owned. So we tried to reflect all of that in the execution of the piece.
You mentioned wanting to make it feel like it was a movie, and I actually had the good fortune of going to your premiere at the Cinerama Dome, the famous Cinerama Dome, with its huge screen. And the thing that I thought to myself while watching it was how cinematic it looked, and all these shots of the town and of the landscape. How do you? Given the fact that this is for television and there's not as much time. I don't know what your shooting schedule or budget were like, but I'm assuming it wasn't like Avengers Endgame level. How do you create that kind of cinematic scope?
I feel like David Klein, the cinematographer, and I were really determined to let it breathe, to use the intimacy of the stages and the sets that we had, and then use the wide open spaces that we had. And we tried to do a lot of variation in the way that we told the story. But the great asset, given the limited time that we had, was that the actors knew their characters intimately. So that right off the bat was a real strong point and allowed us to really spend time making it beautiful.
Well, take us back to that first day on set. I mean, you guys had been trying to do this for so long. You hadn't been together for 13 years. What was it like on that first day on set? And I mean, how did it differ from when you were doing the original series?
Well, the very first day, official day on set, we were shooting Alma's arrival to Deadwood on the train. So big difference right away. People don't show up in a wagon. She showed up in a locomotive. So it was very exciting for us to drag the train out there, stage all of that. It was an uncertain day. People felt a lot of responsibility and the obligation to make it great. It was an exciting day because it was a reunion of a lot of people who hadn't seen each other in a very long time and had a lot of history together. So interestingly, the story that we were telling that day was the story of a homecoming. You know, Alma returns 10 years later to the camp and finds that it's a town. And it really was a homecoming for all of our actors and our crew. You know, a lot of the same people came back, and the producers and even background people were eager to return and work with us again. So it was really a homecoming for us.
What's fascinating about it too is that obviously most of it is wrapping up some events in the third season, but there's so many things that harken all the way back to the pilot episode, that these little story threads and character threads that are getting wrapped up in there. Can you just talk about the ways in which it does that?
The thing that really appealed to me about this script and the design that David had for it was something that really, again, set it apart from other big genre things. You know, one of the tropes of Deadwood and tropes of Game of Thrones and you know, big genre pieces like this is that there's this danger, this imminent danger. Anyone can die at any time. There's a lot of throat slitting, there's a lot of murders, there's a lot of robbery, there's a lot of violence. And this movie shows these people all these years later expressing a kind of remorse for something terrible that they did all that time ago. And I think that really sets it apart. That's very unique. You almost never see the bang-on effect of that kind of violence in movies or in series. And this movie is really about these people reckoning with something terrible that they did 10 years ago. And I thought that made it really unique.
Yeah, and I mean, it's also not afraid to show the passage of time. I mean, you know, 10 years have passed since the events of the third season. And, you know, you see every line and every wrinkle and every gray hair on these people's faces. I mean, so often when we see these sort of revival things, you know, there's a lot of care given to kind of make them look like they did whenever the last episode ended. But, you know, here you really do see the effects of age on people and the effects of, you know, like you said, the things that they did.
What's really beautiful, I think, and without giving too much away, are the time shifts, you know, where we get to see people 10 years earlier and see them today. You know, we get to see the kind of intense love between Alma and Bullock, and then we get to see them today, you know, with graying hair and lined faces. And it's just, I think they look so beautiful. I was really pleased with the idea of embracing that.
Yeah. And also, I mean, you know, we make it sound so dour when we talk about some of the things that happen, but there's this surprising amount of levity and, you know, love in it as well. You know, these, not to give too much away, but, you know, these moments where a lot of good things happen to these characters. And you really see that, you know, despite the violence, despite the anger and greed and corruption, there are people in this town who really do care for each other.
There's, even if you go back and look at the series, for all of its brutality, for all of its craven, you know, craziness, there's a lot of kindness people show each other, and there's a lot of tenderness. And I think maybe people forget a little bit, but there's a certain kindness that people show each other. And this is a movie about community. It's about a community that bands together to face and reckon with the past.
Given how well the actors know their characters, as you said, how do you as a director work with them? Do you need to give them much direction? Do you just kind of, are you able to just let them do their own thing? How do you work with them?
I always start with what the actors bring to me on the day. To me, it's like Christmas. And especially with these actors, these are some of the finest actors I've ever worked with. I start there and then begin to kind of temper it and shape it. And with the help of David, we kind of make sure that everybody's on point. I think one of the things that we experienced a lot in the filming was that people were so emotionally invested, and they were so, there was a bit of a kind of a melancholia about it, or a sweetness to it. And I kind of sometimes had to like snap them away from sentimentality and remind them where we were.
Mm-hmm. Do you think that came from a sense of, where do you think that melancholy came from? Was it just the fact that we're doing it again after all these years, or?
I think there was this show ended so suddenly. People didn't really have a way to prepare for it or a way to grieve it. It just kind of went away. And suddenly they found themselves back there all those years later. And it really is an immersive experience. You're on that back lot, and every direction you look, it's 19th century Deadwood. So that was probably a pretty emotional experience for them. I know it was for me.
Yeah. And for the fans too, I think, people who have invested themselves in watching this for all this time are new fans as well, who've been waiting to see this. I think it's an emotional experience for them as well. Do you think there was sort of a sense of not wanting to disappoint them as well?
I felt a big responsibility to the fans in delivering this movie. We wanted it to be accessible, but we didn't want to dumb it down or over-explain it. And people have a lot of love for the show. We screened it in New York at the IFC with a huge audience of fans, and people went crazy. So I felt gratified that, that people appreciated it. People were shouting back at the screen to George Hurst. People were laughing. People were crying, and they seemed very engaged with the movie. And that made me really happy.
I wanted to talk about David Milch, who obviously created this show and wrote the script for this. Can you talk a bit about working with him and on this particularly?
Working on the movie was a little bit different from working on the series, where we would often come to set and just get handed pages of stuff that David had been ruminating and thought about, and everyone would prepare it and we would rehearse it, and people would go in and memorize their lines. This was different in that he'd had 13 years to work up the script. So we had a very set script. It doesn't mean that we always stuck to it or David wanted us to be slavish to it, but we had a really good idea of where we were going every day on set. And every day would begin with David coming to set. Before rehearsal, he would welcome the actors back, and he would have written something in the car on the way out to the ranch, and he would read it to us all. A bit of a rumination on where the character had been for the last 10 years that was working today. What the emotion was of the scene and how the relationship between these two people had changed, for example. And it was very beautiful. It was very inspiring. And, he was there every day for us.
Obviously, he's been in the news recently because of his Alzheimer's diagnosis. Was that something that, to what extent were all of you aware of that? And I mean, did that affect the work that you guys were doing at all?
I wasn't aware of what it was that was troubling him until he went public with it. I think David had slowed down a little bit, but I found him just as accessible. He was sharp. He was always there for us if we needed a revision. You know, he would zip back to the trailer. We would sit there, work on it together, and come right back. So, you know, David has a lot of support and love from the people that work with him. So between all of us, we made it happen.
What is it about him that makes him a genius, number one? And number two, for you as a director, working with material like this and on the show that is so dense, that is so complex, that is so character driven, what does that do for you as a director? What did you learn as a director working on this show and on this film?
Well, interestingly, Deadwood was one of the first series that I worked on. So I had worked on 6 Feet Under with Alan Ball, and then I went directly to work on Deadwood, having made 2 features. But working with a writer like David it's a kind of a mentorship. David kind of he doesn't instruct so much as you know on set as much as he would mentor us, and that would be in every way, from you know his sense of dramatic structure was always surprising, always fresh, and always based very much in human behavior and emotion. So I kind of cut my teeth, you know, working with David and those actors. So there's still a lot. I learn a lot on every job. What was great about this is it felt like the culmination of many years. I worked with David for 3 years on Deadwood and another year on another series, and it felt like the culmination of a lot of work. And I employed a lot of what I learned, you know, working with him and just through my own experience. David has the greatest respect for the work and the text. He also is completely light on his feet and aware all the time of what everyone's doing, and will incorporate it right away into the scene if it's better than what he had written. So yeah, it was a remarkable experience, and I feel like it was the culmination of many years of work, and that he entrusted me with his movie.
Yeah, I think you feel his imprint on every single thing that he writes. You know, I mean, it almost feels as if he's breathed on it in some ways. You know, in this movie especially, I think you feel that. Before I let you go, I wanted to ask you about your Emmy win, which happened just last year for The Assassination of Gianni Versace. Can you talk a bit about what that recognition meant for you and for everyone involved in that show who won?
The win we had for Versace was so exciting. I always feel really lucky to get to work with, you know, some of the best writers and crews in the business, but this one was exceptional. I absolutely loved working with the producers, Ryan Murphy, Brad Simpson, Nina Jacobson, Alexis Martin Woodall. We had such a good collaboration, and to be able to be there for that from beginning to end on that particular story, I felt like Ryan and Brad really perfectly cast me for it. I thought it was really an important thing to do. It felt important. I felt like it was really entertaining. And it was a story that was very close to me because I lived through that period. You know, I would have been the same age as those people in that time. So I felt like I really had something to bring to it. And everybody really supported me with what I wanted to do with it. So having the Emmy win just made it, you know, that much more amazing. It's such a great team.
Yeah. Well, Daniel, thank you so much for your time, and congratulations on your work. I think that it was well worth the wait for fans.
I hope so. Thank you, Zach.
You're welcome. And thanks to all of you at home for watching. Make sure you click the like and subscribe button below, and make sure you visit us at goldderby.com